names for discussion. Erin, are you okay to? Fantastic. Great. So Qingfeng, can I just hand to you to kind of open the meeting, and then we'll do some housekeeping.
You started with the housekeeping first, or I just
no,
started?
I'll do that. I'll do that following your introduction, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you so much, Catherine. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Environmental Thematic Group, I would like to welcome you all today to attend this opening session for our knowledge series, Sustainable Finance for the Nature Positive Investments, Tools for Integrating Economic and Market-Based Instruments into the projects. My name is Qingfeng Zhang, the Chief for the Rural Development and the Food Security Thematic Group. And sometimes I also concurrently serve as the OIC for Chief of the Environmental Thematic Group. As one of our colleagues in this room aware, ADB is strongly committed to building green, inclusive, and resilient economies across the Asia and the Pacific. And also the ADB Strategy City has environmental sustainability, including natural protection, biodiversity conservation, as one of its core pillars under the operational priority 3. To accelerate our efforts on the nature and the biodiversity, we're now developing a nature positive investment roadmap to provide the strategic direction to better value and also integrate the nature in decision making. The roadmap will provide the blueprint for ADB to scale up nature positive investment in our operations, and also support the DMCs in transition towards the nature positive pathway in their development decision making process. This roadmap will build up our existing and new initiatives to increase the global supply of the natural assets, deliver a post-recovery, post-pandemic recovery, and also create more opportunities for green jobs for our DMCs, which include the first one, of course, we are continuing scale up our and implement the action plan for the health ocean and the sustainable blue economy. And the second, we are just introducing a new initiative called the Eastern Asia, Australia Asia Flyway Initiative, essentially very much focused on the migrable protection along the East Asia, Southeast Asia, and also our Pacific DMCs. And finally, we are also introducing a new initiative to transform agri-food system to greening the agricultural value chain as well. So the roadmap will also provide the guidance, mainstreaming of the biodiversity and the natural-based solutions in their infrastructure projects, including the transport, ports, energy, water, telecom, and urban development. Their sponsorship is going to be one of the showcases we're going to demonstrate in our upcoming webinar as well. The roadmap itself is going to be supported by the development of a new natural capital lab. We call it NCL, to incubate, accelerate, and expand the natural capital investment through the natural capital accounting, payment for ecological services, and also their brand financing, and also their capacity building as well. So to support the establishment of natural capital lab, and also formulate this natural positive investment roadmap, over the next few weeks, Environmental Thematic Group is going to organize a number of their sessions to discuss how to integrate incentives such as the taxes, payment for ecological services, and other mechanisms into their project design, and also the generating their environmental benefits. So today, this is the first one, but along with this green supply chain, we also have the other 3 board SMEs integrated in this webinar series, which are there. One is soil waste management, second is air quality management, and then the all resources management. Through these events, our resources person and also the panelists will discuss economic and market-based instruments as a key enabling conditions to scale up a natural capital investment. Our colleagues will discuss the case studies, project examples, and they will also share their key challenges and opportunities faced with the ADB operations in natural positive recovery. I would like to encourage everyone to actively participate in these events and also take full advantage of the vast knowledge and experiences that resources persons will bring with these sessions. With that, I wish all their best with the successful webinar series. And thank you so much. And take this opportunity, I want to thank their staff from the ETG and also our resource person from the operation departments, and sometimes also those panelists from our partner organizations. Thank you so much. Over to you, Catherine.
Thank you very much, Chengfeng. So now I apologize for people joining that you might have been registering as Erin. If this is the case, I understand that you can just rectify that by going into and changing your name. So if you're showing up as Erin, please do that. Just a couple of things to note that this meeting is being recorded, and we're going to start the session with a presentation, but then there will be an opportunity for discussion. So during that time, please raise your hand, or any time during the presentations, please use the chat box to raise questions, and we will then come back to those in the discussion part of the presentation. Erin, do you want to? Yeah, thank you. So we're going to start the session with a presentation by Professor Khanna, which is based on findings from the ADB Sustainable Development Working Paper, Growing Green Business Investments in Asia and the Pacific, Trends and Opportunities. We'll then have a panel discussion, and I will introduce the panel following the presentation, and then we will have an opportunity for a discussion. And particularly, we're wanting to look the team is going to be developing a toolkit out of this to support project development, and so really identifying where some of the opportunities and entry points are for that. So yes, we'll start now with the presentation, and Madhu introduces herself, so I won't do that again.
Good afternoon. I'm Madhu Khanna, Distinguished Professor of Environmental Economics at the University of Illinois. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today about my work on examining the opportunities and challenges of greening supply chains in Asia and the Pacific. This is based on a recently published report as part of the ADB Sustainable Development Working Paper series shown over here. There's a growing trend in businesses becoming more environmentally friendly in the Asia and Pacific region, as shown by the number of firms that are seeking ISO certification, buildings that are getting LEED certification, looking at the number of firms that are participating in green business networks, such as the World Business Council. Many firms are establishing codes of conduct and adopting responsible management practices, as well as disclosing them through annual reports and other mechanisms. But the private sector needs to do more to meet global sustainability targets. Only a third of the companies typically contributed to the sustainability development goals of the UN with their products and services. Carbon emission reduction targets that have been stated by the private sector fall short of those needed to meet Paris commitments. And participation in green initiatives is limited to large firms that are export-oriented, that are foreign-owned, and part of MNC supply chains. There are green businesses can be classified into two types: those that are producing environmental goods that are being used as inputs, as well as technologies that are used by other firms to green their production processes, an example being solar panels. And then there are the larger number of green businesses that are producing a variety of goods and services and have the choice of using green production and management practices. And we're largely focusing on this larger group of firms today. The many drivers for these firms to become greener, these include pressures from the market through consumers and the supply chain, regulations and government policies, as well as pressures from NGOs and citizens. Market-based motivations from consumers and the public that have a preference for goods produced by environmentally responsible firms can play an important role in creating demand for green products and green businesses. Firms are motivated to be green to increase market share by differentiating their products, meeting demand for downstream supply chain for environmentally responsible products, as well as increasing revenue through price premium from environmentally conscious consumers and avoiding negative publicity and boycotts. But there are key constraints to green goods, and one of those is that these are credence goods. And so it's critical to have trustworthy eco-labels that can communicate the greenness of a product through an eco-label that is credible and that is trustworthy. And here, governments and third-party organizations have a key role in developing standards that are transparent and credible. Demand for eco-label products has been growing in Asia and has the potential to grow considerably more. This can be a challenge for small and medium enterprises because they have to conduct environmental impact assessments and other assessments to show that their product is in fact eco-friendly. They may lack expertise, financial and organizational capacity that is needed in order to seek an eco-label. So technical assistance and financial support for getting products eco-labeled can assist SMEs. In addition to that, there is a potential to make the supply chains greener, particularly when the downstream buyers happen to be multinational companies or global firms that themselves seek to be green in response to pressure from social media, consumers, investors, and others, and pass on those pressures up the supply chain to their producers and suppliers so that they can supply inputs that are also green. Many MNCs we know are developing their own global environmental standards that are often more stringent than those of the national countries, than those in the countries where they're operating. And these companies can, by requiring their suppliers to have environmental certifications and adopting responsible environmental management practices, they can actually diffuse the higher environmental standards through their supply chains in the developing countries. Asia is central to the global supply chain for a number of different products to businesses and consumers in the West, and many Asian countries rely heavily on export markets. And so there is a considerable opportunity for these supply chains to become greener, and we already observe some of that happening through the increasing number of firms that are seeking ISO 14001 so that they can in fact qualify as environmentally friendly firms and supply to downstream multinationals. However, there are several challenges to be overcome to really expand the role for green supply chains. These supply chains can be expensive and risky for the downstream buyers. They require support from senior management. They require finding suppliers with resources to adopt these environmental management systems and comply with requirements of certification. And certification costs can be pretty large. And so these are often limited then to large firms. And so the firms that are the large firms in the supply chain may have greater incentive to become greener than the smaller firms. Additionally, there's a need in the developing countries to develop high quality and trustworthy certification systems that are independent of auditors. Here, governments and third-party organizations can play a key role in ensuring that these certifications are in fact trustworthy and credible. Governments can also develop approaches to their own approaches to further supplement green supply chains by offering various kinds of incentives for firms that green themselves, such as regulatory relief, foster access to permits, or other benefits. Additionally, it's important for governments to look at ways in which they can supplement the efforts of the private sector by developing national environmental standards, or by participating in other international environmental agreements that create incentives for domestic firms to become greener. We know that the global economic activity with major environmental impacts that is actually affected by green supply chain effect can be small, and it excludes the products that are largely consumed domestically or exported to other developing countries that have weak environmental standards. So the share of MNCs in production in most developing countries is small. It focuses on few products that are made in developing countries and exported to the developing countries. And it's only consumer concerns tend to be selective and focus on those practices in developing countries that may have more symbolic meaning, like wildlife protection or labor laws, rather than those that may be the most critical, such as local air quality. Other barriers to greening, there are also barriers to greening small and medium enterprises because of the high cost of implementation, need for resources and trained staff, and there's often low environmental awareness within the organization. Lack of consumer demand for green products by these SMEs can be another barrier. Often these firms are operating with low margins and focused on near-term economic performance rather than long-term building a consumer base from green consumers. A regulatory vacuum because of legislation that is not present or not enforced can also limit incentives. And as a result, many Asian SMEs have shown limited response to green supply chain pressures. Governments can play a role in greening supply chains through having public procurement policies that can encourage and reward green businesses, and also that can make the public contracts conditional on environmental performance. Governments can assist small firms in overcoming hurdles necessary for them to green their supply chain. Public-private partnerships that provide training and technical assistance to develop human capital skills, as well as having a credible threat of implementing existing regulations, can also drive change in supply chains. In addition to that, capital markets can play a role in greening businesses. Green businesses need financing to get established and to grow, and this is often difficult to acquire. The initial costs of production are often high, their market returns are uncertain, and so long-term financing is needed to establish green businesses that are often infant industries. They need many years to develop and establish themselves. These firms pose lower environmental risks and also potentially lower economic risks and liabilities in the future. And so capital markets can encourage and reward these firms by lowering the cost of capital for these businesses because they're less risky, providing new financial instruments to establish these green businesses by enabling innovation and investment in green technologies. Rewarding green businesses through a lower cost of capital can be justified because these businesses may have lower risk of liabilities, penalties, and compliance costs in the future and are less likely to receive negative publicity. Investors can adjust the cost of capital to account for the underpriced environmental risks and support the greening of businesses. Capital markets can respond negatively to disclosures about poor environmental performance and thereby signal to firms that the market cares about their environmental performance. In order for this to happen, capital markets need additional infrastructure and other kinds of support. The role of capital markets may be limited to larger firms that are investor-owned, that are consumer-oriented, and therefore may leave SMEs out. Additionally, to enable capital market support requires infrastructure for data gathering, information disclosure, verification, inspection, and penalties to ensure that the data is credible and accurate. And this kind of regulatory infrastructure may be missing in many developing countries or be subject to regulatory capture. Many firms may not care about negative publicity if they're state-owned or small enterprises. And capital markets in developing countries may also prioritize growth rather than environmental performance. So the provision of green finance is another mechanism for encouraging investment in projects that protect the environment. And this can enable firms that are in undertaking projects, for example, infrastructure projects or in other key environmental sectors, by including environmental considerations when making their green investment decisions. Green financing is a small source of financing in Asia, but is growing, particularly in Japan. Public-private partnerships can meet financing deficit by providing concessional financing. And green bonds that encourage investment in low carbon and climate resilient infrastructure, as well as the banking sector, can enable green lending to grow. But this requires developing guidelines and environmental criteria that need to be incorporated. In order for green financing to grow, it is important to have disclosure requirements by firms on their environmental and long-term systemic risks. It's necessary to overcome gaps in the enforcement of environmental regulations and pricing of emissions. Currently, fossil fuel subsidies can limit profitability of green investments, and lack of awareness about the threats posed by environmental degradation and climate change, as well as lack of trained staff to assess these risks, can also be a challenge to implementing green financing instruments. Generating and developing rating and labeling mechanisms for green bonds can increase demand. Having labeling standards, ensuring transparency and verifiable environmental disclosure requirements can build investor and lender trust. And achieving a cultural change in financial markets to include sustainability considerations can also help to increase the availability of financing and motivate investment decisions that consider sustainability. There are some examples where financial incentives to green bond investors and banks can be provided by institutions like ADB and USAID that can give some credit guarantees to the lending banks to reduce the risk of payment from green projects by the borrower. And this can develop long-term credit becoming available to encourage investments in Asia. Additionally, ADB has been participating in green finance through issue of green bonds and providing this partial credit guarantees that I mentioned to reduce the risk of payment from green projects by the borrower. It can play a more impactful role by supporting development of uniform norms for developing green projects and standards for rating and labeling green bonds. It can help with capacity building programs to train banks on how to evaluate environmental risks and help the financial industry to develop sustainable financing practices, and as well also support innovations in lending instruments to create instruments for financing sustainable long-term projects. In addition to this, it is possible for markets, for environmental services, to create incentives for preserving environmental resources and avoiding degradation. One such mechanism is through ecotourism, which can provide benefits to local communities and conserve the environment. It can bring jobs and business opportunities and diversify sources of income for local communities and increase profits. But the impact of environmental ecotourism is often mixed because it does not fulfill its promise to local communities by fairly distributing the economic benefits. It can lead to displacement of communities and land insecurity. It can also disturb rather than preserve wildlife behavior. And employment opportunities may in fact be concentrated and benefit some skilled people from urban areas rather than local people that may have skill constraints. So increasing the effectiveness of ecotourism requires a number of enabling guidelines and regulations that restrict the scope of recreational use to prevent any environmental harm, and that set some guidelines and policies to ensure that that can ensure good governance of ecotourism and sustainable tourism, avoid greenwashing, and ensure that there's proper implementation of sustainable tourism policies. In addition to this, markets for biodiversity can also help to businesses to internalize the impact of their actions on biodiversity, and they can enable both biodiversity conservation and economic development. The goal of biodiversity offsets is to achieve no net loss and preferably even a gain in biodiversity by requiring in-kind compensation that balances biodiversity losses. The goal is to avoid any impact or reduce impacts, and then to consider an offset if impacts cannot be avoided. And here there's various mechanisms for developing biodiversity markets. One is through having regulations where the government sets a limit on the allowable impact to a species and let the market determine the cost of offsetting impacts above the limit. Governments can also purchase biodiversity services by acquiring land or conservation easements, or by creating payment programs for biodiversity stewardship activities. And then biodiversity markets can be developed based on voluntary efforts and donations and philanthropic efforts to conserve species, habitats, and so on. But a few challenges here as well. Firstly, is just a conceptual challenge, which is that of accepting that ecological losses at one location can be offset by preserving biodiversity elsewhere. There is a need to develop best management practices, guidelines, and methods to assess these offsets and provide certainty about the benefits of government policies. And there are also practical implementation challenges because of non-compliance, as well as offsets only being partially implemented, that need to be overcome. So in summary, there is a significant opportunity for green businesses in Asia and Pacific to develop as the global environmental market expands in the coming years. The efforts to promote green business require a robust regulatory framework, proactive engagement of domestic civil society, and pressure from markets and consumer goods, as well as capital markets and ecosystem markets that can create the right incentives. Much of the civil and green supply chain pressure that is currently being faced in Asia is coming from environmental policies and consumers in the Western world rather than being generated domestically. And this can then limit those pressures being only felt by firms that are supplying to foreign buyers and consumers. And this then means that external pressure focuses attention on some environmental issues in developing countries, but is not as effective in targeting attention towards the environmental problems caused by SMEs that are serving domestic markets. Regulatory pressures in green finance are critically needed to encourage technological innovation and commercial scale deployment, as well as to facilitate more green businesses to green their supply chains and adopt environmentally responsible production and management practices. Thank you very much for your attention.
So thank you very much to Professor Khanna there. Unfortunately, she can't join us in person just due to time differences, but we'll pick up many of the themes. I think she set the context and the wide variety of entry points that can be used to both encourage green supply chains. So I'd now like to welcome the panel. We have 4 great contributors to demonstrate both experience within ADB projects, on the sovereign and the private side, and then also representatives from Switch Asia, which is a facility supported by the European Commission that's been operating since 2007 and promotes sustainable consumption and production across Asia, and then also bringing in a perspective from green businesses, and that's the Business for Sustainable Development Coalition in the Philippines. So first of all, if I can introduce Lorraine Gatlabayan, who is the Senior Advisor on Sustainable Consumption and Production from the Switch Asia Sustainable Consumption and Production Facility. And I think you have some slides, is that right, Lorraine?
Yes, I have slides, and can the ADB also present it? Yes, thanks, Erin.
Thank you, Lorraine.
All right. Okay, first of all, thank you for giving the Switch Asia program this opportunity to take part in this ADB knowledge series on greening supply chains, trends, and opportunities. So I will be presenting 3 points. First is an overview of the EU Switch Asia program. Second is how the program is promoting sustainable consumption and production and supporting governments and businesses and SMEs on greening supply chains in Asia. And third is some key points on the importance of SCP, especially towards COVID recovery. So slide 2, please. Next slide. Thank you. So the Switch Asia program has been launched in 2007, and it is the largest European Union funded program promoting sustainable consumption and production. It has supported so far 24 countries in Central, South, Southeast Asian countries. And nearly around 300 million euros have been invested towards promoting SCP practices along value chains and micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises in the region. Next slide, please. So the program also provides technical assistance to governments, supporting them on improving their national strategies and action plans with regard to sustainable consumption and production practices. It also carries out advocacy activities at regional level. And Switch Asia is currently being implemented through 3 components: the grant program, the SCP facility, and the regional policy advocacy component. And the Switch Asia program provides a green solution by working at all levels, bringing in the EU experience and providing support to governments and other partners. And Switch Asia is supporting countries through in the formulation of SCP policies and action plans, and also in their implementation. Next, please. Okay, so the Switch Asia program is guided by the EU policy, such as the European Green Deal, Farm to Fork Strategy, Circular Economy Action Plan, and so forth, and has contributed to these objectives to provide support in the Asian region. And it provides support to through multi-stakeholder approaches, and also supporting policies in partnership with governments, and also coordinating with stakeholders, particularly in the business sector, through the grants project. Next slide, please. And as mentioned, Switch Asia is supporting national action plans on SCP, and we've already provided support to various countries in the region in developing their regional and international roadmap and action plans on SCP. And these look at key areas such as green public procurement, eco-labeling, eco-innovation, tourism, and sustainable lifestyles. And also for your information, the Switch Asia program is partnering with the ASEAN Secretariat and also with Indonesia to develop the SCP framework for ASEAN. And this is it aims to be a guide and collaboration and coordinated investment and efforts between interested partners in the region and also in national level activities to strengthen synergies and bring networks together for a greater collective impact in the region. Next slide, please. So also Switch Asia is continually supporting countries in the region, and not only in the development of their national action plans, but also policy support in various SCP related issues, such as agri-food, sustainable procurement, renewable energy and energy efficiency, agriculture, and plastics and waste. Next, please. And also these projects also look at the product value chains, looking at entry points to incorporate policy option or practices towards sustainable supply chain management and cleaner production systems in the various thematic areas. And besides the production side, we are looking at actions to increase sustainable consumption by building capacity and awareness and involving stakeholders and consumers. Next slide. So I mentioned also the Switch Asia grant projects. We are helping companies, particularly SMEs in various sectors, to adopt cleaner technologies and more sustainable industrial practices. And also the program has, next slide please. The program has funded around 130 projects across a wide range of sectors: energy efficiency in industrial plants and houses, agri-food, and so forth, in the region over the period of 15 years. And it has supported 500 Asian and European nonprofit partners, about 100 private sector associations, and indirectly benefiting up to 80,000 MSMEs. Next slide, please. So the evidence provided by the projects is meant to feed into policy and regulatory discussions with national governments, supporting them in adopting SCP national plans and regulatory frameworks. And we are now looking at the replication and scaling up effect of these grant projects through access to finance and also through public-private investments for green products, services, and technologies. And this will be key elements within the Switch Asia program in the next years in order to have a greater impact in the region. It is also important for us to continue collaboration with other partners who are pursuing the same objective. And we just published a report on the business case for financing sustainable consumption production practices. And this is in the context of a review of the Switch Asia grant scheme and its projects. And part of the review specifically focused on access to finance opportunities as a key area to scale up and for replication. And based on the summary of the report findings, there are several factors that seem to be enabling successful financing of bankable business cases at scale through financial product development, also in cooperation with local financial institutions. And this includes multi-stakeholder involvement, the assessment of enterprises' bankability, and the local financial market readiness, and the use of tested approaches to develop financing pipelines that are standardized and built on established relationships or invest in relationships building between MSMEs and financial institutions. So in Asia, SCP relevant SMEs or technologies in reality is often excluded from formal financing through banks or investors. So it is important that support coming from platforms such as the Switch Asia program to support in providing this alternative financing options and to provide them links and collaborations with other partners to get access to finance. Next slide, please. So in the terms of the valuing Switch Asia work and synergies, at this time during the pandemic, we saw the disruption in the global value chain in the Asian countries. This also comes with opportunities to integrate SCP narrative properly, correctly, and adequately into policies and business models. And we're also looking at this opportunity on how to support countries, their government, and also through the SMEs in dealing with the pandemic towards recovery. And in view of the recovery, the SME should engage in adopting greener and more sustainable production practices. And they could do this with the support by getting access to market access and also on finance. And SMEs also benefit from partnerships that provide them access to information, capacity building opportunities, and finance towards greener technology and cleaner production. So next slide, please. So there's a need to continually share country experiences and draw lessons on the challenges and achievements in developing and implementing sustainable consumption production policies, and also drawing experiences from other regions. And continued cooperation is needed to access finance and to build capacity to effectively implement SCP policies. And Switch Asia welcomes collaboration with partners to pursue this objective. Thank you, and I look forward to answering any questions, if any.
Thank you so much, Lorraine. There's such a wealth of experience in the EU Switch Asia programme. And I think particularly the experience with MSMEs and SMEs, which bridging that gap. I think unless there's any very quick questions in terms of clarification, I suggest we will come back to all the questions following all of the presentations. But so thank you very much. And I'd now like to call on Takeshi Ueda, who's a Principal Natural Resource and Agricultural Economist in the Southeast Asia Department. Takeshi has 20 years of professional experience with ADB, as well as with the FAO and JICA. I think you've got your own slides, Takeshi, is that correct?
Sure. Okay, thank you. Okay, good evening. Do you see me? Are you okay?
Yes, we can see
okay.
you and the slides.
All right, that's good. Yeah, so thank you very much for the opportunity. This is Takeshi Ueda. I've been working for ADB for last 13 years. And before then I was working for FAO. And this greening agriculture value chains, when I was asked to join this, I was just questioning if I have intended to make projects or formulate projects for the purpose of greening agriculture value chains. To be frank, I mean, never, but I came across this term about 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, actually. UNIDO has been promoting this terminology, greening agriculture value chains, I think as early as like 2010. And I had that certainly in mind. However, to conceptualize doable, but to make it operational, it is quite tough. And also, it was less pressure that time to go for green. So that's why I didn't really, explore this. However, today's presentation, I just want to share with you the kind of perspective that I came or reach by just digging what I have done in the past. So first, I want to share areas where this greening agriculture value chain can happen, which Professor also shared, and then ADB's efforts and some examples. So that's the structure of my presentation. Okay, right. So certainly consumer side, we can do change diet, we can do change origins of food, locally grown, since transportation cost is quite low, logistic cost, we are importing so much, we are getting food from, opposite of the globe, but actually all the environmental costs and everything is factored in the price. Probably this wouldn't happen, but that's how it is. The rule is set. And then reduce food waste at home. This is US data. 40 to 50% of food loss happens at home. So it's quite large. Yeah, now producer side, on farm, ADB has been working for decades on farm. And we are promoting less agrochemical use, less plastic use, less water use, less no tillage, crop rotation. There are many ways we are doing. And the processing, yes, we also are trying. This is relatively new, but less energy use, changing energy source to renewable energy, less water use, less packing, plastic use, less food loss in processing facilities. We are doing various, and also sales. We are doing. I mean, now more and more projects are having this kind of component. Less energy use for food storage, refrigeration, and trying for less food loss. Then transport, suddenly, you know, there are so many areas that can be done, and ADB is contributing, like efficient overall transport and logistics systems. I mean, our transport sector colleagues, I mean, they're working hard. So these are the areas, but I believe ADB has been doing more on producer side rather than consumer side. So I just want to share some efforts. Commonly, we are doing through environment safeguard compliance and going a bit beyond, which is environment sustainability measures or climate proofing in project design, which we have been doing more and more. Then actually no cost for environment safeguard compliance for concerned stakeholders, such as farmers, fishermen, or, you know, rural communities, because sovereign projects pay for. But now we are getting more and more projects with engagement of private sector. And the private sector, we certainly want to apply more commercial, you know, norm. So mechanisms required to get the stakeholders to pay for environment safeguard compliance is important. But I mean, again, we are dealing with some countries where environmental laws and regulations are not followed. And also we are dealing with SMEs. So if we push this without the context, I mean, it is quite difficult. They may not sustain. So now, how to incentivize greening? So instruments at project level, I mean, we have this concessional financing through financial intermediary loans to promote green financing for agriculture value chains. And also, I mean, matchmaking with international buyers. Some project we are matchmaking with international buyers, with developing countries, agro-processing companies. So, I mean, this is another way to kind of bring it up the level, but at the same time, they can get the reward through higher revenue. And also we can provide business advisory service. So we can really help them to put these environment sustainable aspects to their business proposals. Yeah. And then instruments at the regional level, green financing mechanism. What we have in Southeast Asia, this ASEAN Infrastructure Fund. This is architect is Anuj, you may know, SCRD. So, and now challenges, setting up feasible and sustainable mechanism at project level, given specific context. This is always challenging. And yeah, then mobilizing grants, concessional funds in greening agriculture value chains. And that's another challenge, yeah. So let's move to examples that I can share. One is Hanang Sustainable Livestock Farming and a Product Safety Demonstration Project. This project was a bit contentious, and there were some criticism about this project. This project is supporting medium to large meat processors and livestock farms in China. And we went a little beyond environment safeguards for these environment sustainability measures. For instance, like we did some water and we did some management and also waste management. And yeah, certainly recycling this livestock waste. And water, rural enterprises, meat processors, they often do not have link to, water supply pipeline. So they most, dig groundwater and use. But we found many of them are not really, using meter or paying for the amount of water that they use. So we help them install water meter, and we help them to monitor and report. So these small things, we can make some difference. The Mongolia Agriculture Rural Development Project. So this is the project we used financial intermediary loan. And we helped each and every these agro enterprises. They borrow subloans from the project. We help them to prepare this environmental safeguard documents for ADB. They have to pay for domestic documents, which is already quite costly. So we were supporting to translate that to ADB documents and also giving them idea how they can do better for the environment. So this is another example. And lastly, Agriculture Value Chain Competitiveness and Safety Enhancement Project. This was approved last year, and we are still working on, but we are doing pilot green financing scheme with the financial support of ASEAN Infrastructure Fund and technical support of ASEAN Catholic Green Finance Facility. Lastly, I just, here are links. And I also show some references. Early work of UNIDO, it's interesting. So if you are interested, please have a look. So thank you very much. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for Takeshi for trying to apply that to real projects. And I think that's an interesting thing for us to discuss later is when is the value of taking a supply chain approach and where does it particularly add value? And I think that there are issues around the location of the risk, the supplier volume, and also the opportunity for sustainable policies or involvement of relevant standards. So I think you've raised some very interesting points there and very useful to contextualize it in some specific projects. I'd now like to ask Kate Jarvis from the private sector team, if you can come in and give your perspective. And I know you're quite new to ADB, but your focus is on improving the investment climate. So again, addressing some of the issues that have been raised on climate resilience and gender equity within their agribusiness value chain. So yeah, I'm sure if are you just going to present, or were you also?
I do have some slides. I can try. I haven't done this on Zoom for a while, so let me see whether it will work. So this is my...
No, it's really difficult when you switch between platforms and your brain is wired for using one platform. But please don't feel you need to use slides as we discussed before, because I think you've got some great, the toolkit that you were discussing is I
might just talk if that's okay. My slides are pretty simple anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, no problem. Well, look, thank you very much, Catherine, and to your team for inviting me to speak today. Thanks also to Madhu and Lorraine and Takeshi for your great presentations. My name is Kate Jarvis. I'm a climate finance specialist in PSOD's agribusiness investment team, which we call AIT. I work with our private sector agribusiness clients to maximise the climate change mitigation and adaptation features of our investments. So with AIT's clients, the focus is predominantly on the greening of businesses. And so I'll share a few examples that are all in sort of development stage rather than existing projects that have been approved. So things that we're looking at are developing a project with a global commodity merchandising company to replant aged cocoa trees with climate resilient hybrid varieties. So AIT would provide CapEx for the trees and working capital, which would be used for advance payments to farmers who would then own these hybrid varieties of trees. In another example, we're working with another global agribusiness client to develop a carbon offset forestry project in Southeast Asia. Madhu mentioned that MNCs are facing increased pressure from their customers to reduce their carbon footprint. And we're really seeing that with our large clients. So some have now made commitments to become net zero by 2050. Another example that I think is really interesting is in plant-based protein production, and this has very strong potential in Asia. I find it interesting because the sector is developing very quickly, and it's a clear demonstration of our clients' desire to provide products that have a lower environmental footprint. And as Takeshi has mentioned, it's driven really fundamentally by that changing consumer behaviour to eat more plant-based foods. AIT has traditionally supported and will continue to support a sustainable livestock industry in Asia, but we know that livestock contributes to greenhouse gas emissions, and we know that plant-based meat products have the potential to satisfy consumers' demand for high-protein meaty foods at a much lower environmental cost. So therefore, we've been really proactive about finding investment opportunities in the sector. For instance, we've engaged an independent consultant to conduct a market study to help us identify potential clients that are developing these projects. In terms of the incentives that we provide to our clients to support the greening of agribusiness supply chains, we're currently leveraging 5 main tools. So firstly, we attach technical assistance or TAs to our financings, and these often focus on trainings for smallholder farmers in climate resilient agricultural practices. Second, we aim to mobilise blended finance by working with ADB's managed funds, such as the Australian Climate Finance Partnership, the Canadian Fund for the Private Sector in Asia, or JICA's LEAP Fund. So blended finance can be used where a project has significant development impact, but may not be entirely feasible if it were to be financed on purely commercial terms. So in those situations, the blended finance can provide different rates, tenor, security, or rank, and therefore can help to de-risk those investments. Another comment that Madhu made as well was that the large firms in the supply chains may have greater incentive to become greener than the smaller firms. So blended finance is actually a really important tool that we can use to support the smaller firms, which may otherwise face challenges in accessing finance. Another tool that we use is to reward green business through a lower cost of capital through sustainability linked loans. And these are actually quite simple. So under this structure, a client receives a small discount on the interest rate for achieving predetermined climate or social KPIs, and a penalty if they miss those KPIs. Another initiative that we have is to tag our investments as green or blue or sustainable. So we've recently been supporting a client to establish a sustainable finance framework. And those measures or those tags they do require quite stringent reporting on companies' ongoing sustainability initiatives. And that can help our clients to access future financings from commercial banks which have sustainability targets themselves. And finally, something that we would like to do more of is to support our clients through the certification process for their products. So Madhu also mentioned that many MNCs are seeking suppliers that have environmental certifications. And there are plenty of examples in agribusiness. There's Bonsucro for sugar, there's the Better Cotton initiative, there are fair trade products. Many of our clients do wish to become certified, but they are quite overwhelmed by the requirements. And this is an area where AIT can potentially support. So I'll pause there and I'd welcome any questions.
Thank you so much, Kate. I think we'll come back to questions following all of the presentations. But yeah, I think I don't know if everyone's aware of those tools, and I think there's a lot to unpick with how we can apply some of them and begin to mainstream them more broadly. And I think we've already got some questions around certification, so we'll certainly come back to that at the end. So thank you, and thank you for responding to the broader presentation. So finally, I would like to invite Bona Loreto to speak. He's the Executive Director of Business for Sustainable Development Philippines, which I mentioned earlier, and previously Director of Law for Nature Foundation, and has worked with a wide range of organizations, but yeah, they work specifically with companies to integrate sustainably into their business. So really pleased to have you here, Bona, to give a perspective from your member companies and what you're seeing from that perspective.
Thank you, Catherine, and thanks to ADB and the staff for having us today and for allowing us to share our perspective on the subject matter. So I didn't prepare a presentation because I intended to provide insights directly hitting on the key messages provided by our main speaker. But I'd like to mention a little bit of what we do as they come relevant to the points I'm going to be talking about. So thanks for mentioning that I spent more than 10 years, the past 10 years, working with the private sector, from the biggest conglomerates to the medium-sized companies, trying to work with the senior level executives, the CEOs, CFOs, and department heads of these respective corporations to try and figure out how to best embed sustainability and how to enable them to tackle the biggest societal challenges at scale through their core businesses, products and services, through their risk management processes and innovation and strategy development processes. And over the years that we've interfaced with them, we've learned a couple of things. And these learnings is what I'd like to share in relation to what has been discussed by our main speaker. So our main speaker talked about several ways to influence corporate behavior towards greening their own businesses and greening their supply chains. But what we've seen based on our experience working with these corporations is that still the consumer behavior, the shift in consumer behavior still isn't proving to be a big driver for corporate behavior to adopt sustainability practices. What we've seen, though, which is proving to be very effective, and it's becoming more and more effective, is the pressure that the investors are putting on them as far as not just disclosing on their sustainability performance, but also providing publicly disclosed strategies and targets as far as how they would like to improve their performance. So we've seen and I've spoken to a lot of CFOs, marketing people, those people in private sector who tinkers with their own data analytics as far as consumer data is concerned. And what they're saying is that while consumers would think and say that they'd like to buy and prefer more consumer goods that are green or sustainable, as evidenced by multiple consumer surveys, when they analyze actually the consumer purchases of their products, let's say a retail company looking at their consumer purchases, actual purchases, it's very difficult to draw some correlation between the greenness of the product versus the purchasing preference. So still, in the context of the Philippines, where majority of the mass-based market are still low-income segment, paying a premium for more sustainable products is not yet a trend. And so the work that we do mostly do not, especially at this point, delve on driving business cases from a consumer standpoint, but we explore other avenues where we can, and entry points where we can get the corporations to really look at how they should act on their impacts towards environment, society, and the economy, as well as the governance aspects of their organization. And what we've seen, which is proving to be really effective, is where you can demonstrate that there is an impact to the corporate, to the financial position of the company, whether it's a risk or whether it's an opportunity. So we use risk and opportunity framework in trying to convince private sector companies in the Philippines to make sustainability an important priority of the company. And so far, based on the multiple engagements, we've engaged with more than 40 large and medium-sized corporations, and we've engaged with them for close to 100 engagements over the past more than 10 years of work. And over these years of work, we've seen that what really worked in terms of getting corporate behavior to prioritize sustainability is when they see real value in terms of avoidance of costs. For example, tackling climate change in the point of view of avoiding future costs by acting now and creating mechanisms to avoid future costs in climate change, such as sea level rise or carbon taxation, for that matter. And so this is compounded. This trend, so to speak, is compounded by the more and more becoming more stringent approach of investors in analyzing the firms they're investing into, or even the banks that are providing loans to them. I've talked to multiple conglomerates, and they've told me that many of the loan applications that they've had in the past 2 or 3 years have really been evaluated on the basis of ESG, and ESG has become part of the priorities of the board and the senior management because of that. And for which reason, more and more companies are seeking our help to set ambitious targets. Science-based targets on climate change has been there. At their industry level, more and more companies are turning into green and sustainable because it is being asked by their financial services providers or their investors. So I believe this powerful market-based mechanism that shapes corporate behavior, particularly in the Philippines, is something that can be taken advantage of in terms of greening the supply chains, if only more of these rating companies like MSCI, Sustainalytics, Bloomberg would require more stringent metrics, and if ADB and other influential organizations can influence these rating companies and investors to take a good look at how companies they're investing in are managing their supply chains and making these companies disclose more on the supply chain management performance. I think that will drive the greening of the supply chain. When your investors will ask you, what are you doing as far as assessing the carbon performance, energy performance, effluent performance of your suppliers? When that question pops up, then it quickly becomes a priority of the company. So at least from our experience, that's what worked. But I also, and certification processes such as ISO 14000, we've seen companies get certified with that, and yet there is no guarantee that their energy performance, water, effluent emissions, and others are actually within standards within their industry. So what I think, which I agree also, which is a point raised by a speaker on a national environmental standards for industries, I totally support that idea. I think that will level the playing field, where every company will have to adhere to an environmental standard. But this environmental standard can't just be in any form. It needs to be sector specific. It needs to respect the performance of what is material to each of the sector. And it needs to be performance based, meaning, for example, for beverage companies, performance based metrics and standards would look something like how much water you use per liter of beverage that you produce. We're aware of benchmarks with the companies that we work with. Coca-Cola, for example, has a 2.4 liter water use to per liter of beverage that they produce. Some are at the 4 liter per liter, 4 liter of water per beverage liter of beverage produced, and others are at 6 or 7. These standards that are performance-based and sector-specific is something that we need as an important driver, which sets the level playing field, which now internalizes the externalities of environmental impacts that has been going on since capitalism came to be. So I think having standards that requires each sector to meet certain performance-based standards will be helpful in driving greening the supply chains. Incidentally, we have worked with the Climate Change Commission and the Department of Labor and Employment, working on the Green Jobs Act guidelines and standards. I was personally engaged by the ILO to work on to build the standards, industry-specific standards for what can be classified as green industry and what cannot be classified, creating the thresholds that are reflective of the current state of industries in the country. Those have been drafted. They are in the Climate Change Commission, and I would urge ADB to take a look at what Climate Change Commission have as far as performance standards is concerned. And what needs to be done is to get that become part of the national policy, so that every company working in the Philippines must adhere to certain performance standards, and that will drive sort of more companies to really come up to a minimum standards for them to operate in the country. I think setting a level playing field around that in that way will get more and more companies to really take greening the supply chain more seriously. There was a discussion around how do we now eventually get the SMEs on board, since capital markets investors really focus on the large corporations and publicly listed companies. How do we get SMEs on board? I mentioned earlier that the investors must require their investing companies to disclose their management approach as far as managing the environmental performance of their supply chains. But the other approach would really be to involve the cooperatives. In the Philippines, I've spoken to an association of cooperatives. They have about 800 members. They do fill in a certain gap in financing beyond what banks can cover. They have a much higher appetite for risks, and therefore they're able to provide financing for much smaller organizations. These cooperatives are very good vehicles beyond just what the banks are doing now to get the investments, the SMEs they're financing, to also look at the green standards before they can avail of the loans. Engaging with these cooperative associations and federations is a good approach. For those of you who are in the green finance world, you're aware of the BSP regulation that was issued last year on sustainable finance framework. Each bank are supposed to come up with their own sustainable finance framework, which includes an environmental and social risk management system. We're in the middle of this work. We're supporting our clients, our member companies, banks, to build a framework that really achieves the purpose of greening the companies that they're trying to finance. But what we're realizing quickly is that if every bank would have their own threshold, and the market will respond, will go to banks that are of lower threshold, then necessarily those with higher green thresholds will become less competitive. And if we allow things that way, then the issuance of a green sustainable finance framework will be of no use, because at the end of the day, if companies would still say that I'm able to finance coal that is not super critical by 2023, and others would say I'm going to still be able to finance by 2030, then it will still not influence the behavior of investors, of business people in the country to shift to more renewable types of investments. So what needs to be done at that level is to have a common industry threshold that all banks must agree to what should be the threshold as far as what they are willing to finance today in terms of these critical industries like coal, and what is the roadmap of from now until 2030 as far as moving away from financing coal. And if every bank will have that, then it will shape the kind of investment in energy in the Philippines. That is just citing one sector, and that can be applicable in many other sectors. And finally, ecotourism has been discussed. There are models in the country, PES models, payment for ecosystem services models, but as you see that many, the speaker has pointed out many drawbacks of ecotourism, such as unequal distribution of revenues and value of ecotourism. And environment would be the least in terms of getting a share of the PES. And so what we think will work best would be a PES that's mandatory. Every company should be mandated operating and using ecosystem services, should be mandated to pay a certain amount, which will go to a certain fund. And this fund will only be disbursed to entities who are able to demonstrate results in terms of conservation of certain biodiversity. We call this, we have a paper on this, and we call this CESV. We call this compensation for ecosystem services value improvement. Now you get paid if you're able to demonstrate that you've improved the ecosystem services in front of you. And you get paid by the fund that is drawn from mandatory PES, the fund that is put together through the mandatory PES of all users. We have this paper and we've presented this in multiple occasions, and we'd like to get this brought into at the policy level to make it mandatory. That I think will create a private sector finance mechanism that will ensure biodiversity is restored and ecotourism is fully supported and sustained, because we know that ecotourism relies on the natural capital for its value creation. There's many more thoughts I'd like to be able to share, but we are given very limited time. We're happy to discuss further with the speakers, with ADB, on what are the ways, what are the approaches that can work with private sector, that can truly create systemic change and not just incremental change. Thank you for the opportunity, though. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you very much, Bona. That was a very useful perspective, and I think particularly touching on the point that we have one of the questions here already. So I'm going to take the Kate is also responding to that question directly in the chat, but I think you've highlighted this point between and James's question as well, between the first mover advantage in creating a sustainable business, and then also but wanting to move that and shift shift regulation at the same time. And I think that's the opportunity that we have within ADB to try and push for projects that are able to do that and to push for that regulatory change. And I know certainly that within the raw supply chain, there's a big focus on the Consumer Goods Forum companies beginning to take what they call a landscape or a jurisdictional approach, which is when contractors can make their commitment to source preferentially from jurisdictions which are showing to be effectively implementing programs that are operating within resource constraints. So I think that's an interesting or another example of how you can begin to bridge that gap between individual certification and then building that consensus for a more regulatory approach. Maybe if the panelists would have any further thoughts on so James's question was specifically, well, James, do you want to come in and explain it a little bit in terms of are you asking that people would not have that cost benefit in terms of not being able to get a premium from a certification system?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. It's the question. It's a difficult balance, and I don't think there's a right answer. Kate's very kindly answered it, and Takeshi-san's also been answering. But the question is there's a quantum between the difficulty in achieving, or the perceived difficulty in achieving, the compliance certification and the benefit that it brings, and that benefit, whether it's sort of in a cash value benefit as you can sell your crops at a higher rate, or it is a marketing or an investment benefit in as much as an investor sees you as having a higher value or a lower risk, or a market, a business to business consumer sees you as being a better value supplier. So it was just a question to raise that idea of how we balance that and where the sweet spot is in the middle, so that it's accessible to small and medium enterprises in our developing member countries, but still has that value. So that was the background of the question, and there's been all sorts of answers, but I'd be interested to hear any other ideas. It was that was the concept.
Does anyone else on the panel want to make? Yeah, Lorraine.
Yeah, just to answer that question on looking at compliance systems, the Switch Asia program provided support to Indonesia to strengthen their green sustainable public procurement. And we conducted a market readiness analysis, just to give you an example how this is done in various issues. And we provided a market readiness analysis for green sustainable photocopy paper and wooden furniture in Indonesia. So the government looked at the readiness of the sector in terms of compliance for certification on eco-labeling for paper, and also the SVLK certification for wooden furniture. And the different stakeholders involved here came from the different associations, from the furniture side and the paper side, and also mapping the different environmental hotspots. So my point here is it's important to have an analysis on the market readiness. And from the study that we conducted, it showed that actually the photocopy paper companies in Indonesia are already eco-label certified, even if they didn't apply for it, because the specification is according to the current green public procurement requirements. However, for example, in the SVLK certification for wooden furniture, it's a different matter, because some local producers are having difficulties to comply with the basic criteria. And it is expensive for SMEs, like, for example, what you said on certification fee for 6 years instead of 3 years. So it's more expensive for them. And the findings from this report show that the government is willing to advance the public procurement on this selected areas through the green public procurement criteria. However, there's a need to ensure that there is market readiness, and this can be done by providing support with the government side, supporting also the budget users on availability of environmental friendly products and certifications for these markets, and also to ensure that that capacity support mechanisms are provided for companies, especially SMEs, to obtain the certification. So that's just an example, for example, in Indonesia. And another example for Thailand is the Switch Asia program is supporting them in drafting the green integration policy that looks at the various certification mechanism. And the stock exchange of Thailand is also on board, and it also included the different companies for our piloting on how they can be able to promote green and sustainable public procurement in stock exchange Thailand. So the initiatives coming from the government and also partnerships with the business side and also from partners, it provides the platform for changes to happen.
Thank you, Lorraine. I think that the point also in your study about the multi-stakeholder approach is very important. I'm very conscious that because we had such rich inputs from our panelists, there's less time for discussion. Does anybody else have anything they would like to ask any of the panelists individually, or specifically following up any points that they've raised?
Catherine, yep.
Yeah.
Yep. May I come in?
Please.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you. To the question of James, it's really, I mean, how to say, very, very tough question. And we are always trying that, I mean, you know, how to ensure financial sustainability of those who try to comply. And, but it's really, we have to assess the context. For instance, I mean, if countries with poor regulatory frameworks or poor law enforcement, this compliance becomes quite costly, because we engage company to comply while the other competitors are not complying. So, you know, it can hurt. And also if, you know, these, for instance, agro-processing companies, I mean, they are selling to, you know, international markets or domestic markets. I mean, how much markup they can make. I mean, that has to match with the cost of compliance. So it's really, I mean, context, it matters. And yeah, to the questions to Cynthia, this, right. I mean, we are dealing with many SMEs, but one interesting example is, I mean, even SMEs, if we can somehow connect with international buyers, sometimes it takes like 5 years for just inspection. But I mean, certainly there is huge markup that can easily, you know, pay off the cost of compliance. So, I mean, this marketing effort, some project we do to connect with like, you know, high premium buyers. So that's one way, but it takes time and it costs some initial cost that we can probably assist through the project. Thank you.
Thank you, Takeshi, and thank you for picking up that question. Just very lastly, I guess, does anyone else want to respond to that question or have any final points on the panel? And I see that, Kate, you're doing very well at responding to the questions on the chat, so thank you for that. You're on mute, Kate.
Sorry, I hope my response is clear, but if anybody has any questions on how it works in practice, then please feel free to reach out to me and I'm happy to share.
In terms of blended finance, great. Yes. Yeah, I'm sorry we didn't have as much time for discussion, but I'd like to encourage people to fill in feedback form, and there's an opportunity in there to raise anything that you would like to know further about, and please feel free to write to myself or anyone else who's organised the web, and anyone else in the Environment Thematic Group if there's anything that you'd like to follow up on. And I think there's a real opportunity for us to have further engagement with the panelists as well in terms of building on some of this. And I'd just like to say that you're all invited to attend all the webinars, and the next one is on the 21st of July, which is going to be focusing specifically on integrated solid waste management and so the plastics economy. So I would just like to say thank you again to all of our panelists for providing so much rich information, and thank you everybody for coming and participating today.
Thank you very much, Catherine.
Catherine.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
Bye.